I came in from my night shift, and then this happened. The hallway lights were dimmed, as they always were after 8 p.m., and the scent of antiseptic had already settled into the air like a second skin. I had walked this corridor hundreds of times, but that night something felt misaligned. I was only supposed to check the vitals in room 2A. Nothing more. But as I pushed open the door, I realized this wasn't going to be one of those nights I could just walk through. I transferred to the mountain clinic in late December, when winter wasn't yet deep, but cold enough to seep through your coat and settle in your chest. The cold here wasn't like the city. Didn't bite. It lingered. Like a stranger standing too close behind you. Not touching, just making sure you knew you weren't alone. I used to joke with the other nurses that I didn't come here to heal patients, I came to stitch myself back together. People say things like that after a breakup, or after quitting a job that drained the soul but paid just enough to smile through meetings. Me? I had no one to leave. No boss to blame. Just me and shifts that stretched longer than necessary. Each evening when the fog thickened like glass over every sound, I would walk the corridor checking room temps and oxygen tanks. Everything moved slowly here. As if even time had to pause to keep the silence intact. I saw him for the first time on a Tuesday, I remember, because it was the first day I wore that ash gray cardigan, the one I thought made me look less clinical. He entered without triggering the front bell, like the hinges already knew how quiet he liked things. I only caught a glimpse of him through the frosted glass of the examination door. The steam blurred the edges like a watercolor left out in the rain. But the eyes, that was the part left untouched. They met mine the way a cold gust slips past your collar. Not the way patients usually look at nurses. More like someone waiting. I asked his name, routine protocol, and he answered calmly. Lionol. Lionel Ash. His name felt like a chord I couldn't quite place but wanted to hear again. His chart read, retired teacher, lives 4 kilometers east, here for a routine BP check. No history. No emergency contact. I led him to room 2A. It's the one closest to the window. The late afternoon light filters through sheer curtains and makes the air sparkle like floating dust. I've always loved that room. It makes me feel seen without having to speak. He sat, hands resting on the table, no longer looking at me. But the weight of his gaze still lingered in the air, like smoke refusing to vanish. I wrapped the cuff around his arm. He didn't touch me, not really, but the warmth from his skin made me inhale just a bit deeper than usual. It wasn't attraction. It was something that had no business showing up at 3 p.m. in a clinic that barely had a pulse. I asked if he'd been feeling anxious lately. He gave a soft laugh. Only when I meet someone unfamiliar. But not exactly strange. I didn't know how to answer that. So I didn't. I noted the reading, my hand slightly unsteady. Maybe from the cold. Or not. As he stood to leave, his coat brushed the edge of the table. I stepped forward instinctively to adjust the fabric, but stopped halfway. Not because I was unsure, but because I realized I had no good reason to do so. I watched him walk out, tall, upright, but with a posture that somehow pulled something behind him, something unseen. That night I made ginger tea with a cinnamon stick I'd saved for weeks. I sat alone in the on-call room, listening to the wind draw itself along the doorframe, and remembered eyes that said nothing, but made me feel not quite unfamiliar. I can't say what it was about him that caught me. Maybe it was that he didn't look at me like a patient does. He looked at me like someone who'd been waiting. He came back the next Tuesday. Same hour. Same clouded sky. Same seat by the window, where the curtain still drooped with that exact, careful slack. I wasn't surprised. But I wasn't quite steady either. That afternoon, the clinic smelled of disinfectant and wood polish, and the wind outside had turned, whistling through the vent shafts in a slightly sharper key. I passed by the front counter and heard the antique clock ticking just a bit off rhythm. I checked it a dozen times. It wasn't broken, but it always seemed slower when he was there. 3 p.m. gray skies and a lukewarm cup placed left of center. He gestured gently toward the mug I'd unknowingly set too far to one side again. Just like last week. I smiled. That was all I could manage. A small, involuntary tug of the mouth that tried to stay neutral. It wasn't what he said. It was how he noticed. And how that noticing felt. Personal. After that, I stopped checking the appointment schedule. I simply knew when he'd walk in. And somehow I always had a free slot. He never asked for me by name. He didn't need to. Every Tuesday the rhythm of the clinic bent around him. The hallway felt quieter. The air more aware. Even the file drawers sounded louder when opened, like the clinic itself was breathing differently. And I started brushing my hair before 3. Just once. Not for the mirror. Not for anyone else. For the possibility of being seen again. "You don't have the hands of a mountain nurse," he said one Tuesday while I adjusted the cuff. "There's a tension in them. Like they're used to holding something back." I didn't reply. But I remember pulling my hands back a second too quickly, and then pretending it was about the equipment. He never commented on the silence. He never filled it. Another afternoon, as we stepped into room 2A, he glanced at the curtain swaying lightly in the window draft. His fingertips skimmed its edge, not touching, just sensing. "This place," he murmured, "keeps things people think they've let go." I didn't ask what he meant, because I knew. And because there's a particular kind of fear that comes not from danger, but from recognition. Patterns formed. He sat in the same spot. I stood at the same angle. The light always came in sideways, and each time I noticed something. A shift in his collar, a scratch in his voice, a glance held 1 second longer than needed. And I kept noticing. I started repositioning the curtain before he arrived, making sure it hung just right. I told myself it was about presentation. But it wasn't. When he left, I lingered. Not to tidy, just to feel what remained. I told myself stories, little lies wrapped in professionalism. That nothing was happening. That I was just sensitive to routine. That the repetition was coincidence, nothing more. But he wasn't just a patient anymore. And I had stopped being just the nurse. There was no touch. No rule broken. No word out of place. But more than once I caught myself leaning closer than I needed to, tilting toward a space I pretended didn't exist. One Tuesday he didn't come, and suddenly the clock ticked in perfect rhythm. No drag, no pause, and I realized it wasn't the schedule that had shifted, it was me. I know I should have felt uneasy, I know I should have stepped back, but all I felt was watched, not violated, not hunted, just seen. In a way that was dangerously calm. The storm rolled in before dusk. By the time I noticed the change in pressure, the road to the valley had already been declared impassable. The snow came sideways, not in soft flakes but in hard angles, the kind that made silence louder. Only one patient remained in the clinic that night. Lionol. The others had gone home early. Staff, visitors, even the stray cat that sometimes curled near the boiler room had vanished. It was just me and him, and the sound of sleet tapping against the tin roof in perfect rhythm, like an impatient clock marking seconds I didn't want to count. I told him he would need to stay. His blood pressure had spiked, though not alarmingly. Still protocol. He accepted it with that same unreadable calm he always wore, like an old coat he never took off. "I'll set up the cot in the staff room," I offered, already walking ahead of him. That room had always felt transitional. Never meant for resting, just for pausing. A blanket folded too neatly. A bulb that flickered even when it wasn't cold. But that night, it felt like the only real space left in the world. I handed him a glass of warm water. As he took it, his finger barely touched mine. Not more than a second. But it happened. Like an unmarked line crossed in fog. He said nothing. Neither did I. Not out loud. Later I checked on him. Again. And again. There was no clinical reason. I just didn't like the idea of him being alone in that dim room while I pretended not to notice how quiet the clinic had become. He sat on the edge of the cot, shirt half unbuttoned. The lamp behind him cast long shadows across his collarbone, like folds of thought pressed into skin. "It's too warm in here," he murmured. "I'll bring a towel," I said. I returned with one too soft, smelling faintly of eucalyptus. I knelt beside him. Wiped his forehead, the side of his neck. I should have stopped there, but I didn't. My hand moved lower, sweeping over his chest. The towel made contact. My palm stayed, longer than it should have. I felt his breath shift, not deeper, just more deliberate, like he was holding still, waiting to see which moment would move first, mine or his. "Do you believe?" he said, not looking at me. That some people are born to sense where others are most alone? I swallowed, but the dryness in my throat didn't leave. I could have stood. I didn't. Instead, I found myself buttoning his shirt. Slowly. Button by button. Not for modesty. Not for routine. He didn't stop me. But when my hand brushed his chest again, bare through the gap in the cloth, I felt something sharper than desire. Recognition. A silence expanded in the room. Wide, warm, unspoken. If I were someone else, he said quietly, you wouldn't be trembling. I didn't correct him. Because he was right. I wasn't afraid. I was awake. In a way I hadn't been in years. I pulled back. Not far. Just enough to make it seem like I could still draw a line if I wanted to. My blouse had slipped slightly off my shoulder. I adjusted it slowly, deliberately. Not to hide, but because I knew he was watching. And I let him. Then I turned. Opened the door. Didn't close it all the way. On my way out, I passed a mirror in the hallway, the kind that distorts slightly in old glass. I caught sight of myself just briefly. Cheeks flushed. Collar askew. But it wasn't my reflection that stayed with me. It was the lingering heat along my arm. From his skin. Or the towel. Or maybe from my own, reawakened by something I didn't expect to want again. When I stepped outside, I realized the blouse I wore was still warm, too warm. I smoothed it out, but the crease across my chest stayed, like a question I hadn't asked and couldn't answer. The next morning, I found myself avoiding the east wing. I told myself it was because I was reorganizing the storeroom, or sanitizing the cabinets, or recalibrating the thermometer. But the truth was, I was timing my every movement not to meet his gaze again. Lionel didn't act like anything had changed. He arrived at the same hour, sat at the same chair, asked for the same cup of hot water, as if last night was a dream we both woke from separately. Only later, when I returned to the consultation room, I noticed the drawer slightly ajar. Inside, an old notebook. No name. No note. Just the smell of dried ink and something older like dust and pine. A few pages dog-eared. A line of verse in messy cursive. Perhaps we are not who we were, but shadows of what we once dared to become. I closed it fast. Like it had whispered my name. I didn't sleep that night. Not from fear. Not exactly. I brewed the same ginger tea he'd once brought me. The taste was wrong, too sharp, too thin. I brewed it again. Then again. Until my kitchen smelled like something I hadn't asked for but now couldn't forget. By the third cup, I stopped pretending the taste was the problem. I started writing letters to no one. Or maybe to myself. Or maybe to him. They began. If I had stayed silent, would it still feel this loud? If I hadn't noticed your hand, would my breath still remember its distance? I never signed them. I never sent them. I folded them in half and left them in my coat pocket, where my fingers could brush against the crease without committing to the opening. Each shift I saw him. Not directly. Not always. Sometimes just a reflection in the metal tray. Or a scent left too long in the air. That cologne, cedar, and something else. Something careful. I no longer trusted coincidence. Or my ability to discern it. A patient file. His moved to the top of my pile without reason. A book I once shelved in the common room, now on the waiting bench where he sat. And the silliest detail. The cup he always used, the chipped one with the faded rim. I began placing it out before I even saw his name on the schedule. He never asked for it. But he always picked it up. The silence between us wasn't cold. It was warm in a way that felt dangerous. Like a quilt left out too long. Familiar. Heavy. One afternoon I opened his notebook again. A new page had been filled. No date. No title. Some hands heal. Some hands haunt. The cruelest ones do both, and leave before you realize which they were. I stared at that line too long. Not because of what it said, but because of what it didn't say. Was he warning me? Or explaining himself? Or neither? I paused at my reflection in the window, but all I saw was the outline of someone waiting, for clarity or a repeat. And then without warning I remembered. A name from the city. A woman. A story. Something about a patient who stayed longer than scheduled. A nurse who stopped coming to work. The memory didn't land. It hovered. Like a fog over a sign you're supposed to read but can't. The room was quiet. Too quiet. Even the clock had stilled, its tick lost in the thickness of doubt. And in that stillness I whispered to no one, "What if I'm not the first?" The tea had gone cold. It was a Tuesday. Quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't invite rest, just tension. She came unannounced. A woman late 50s. Wavy gray hair pulled back. The look of someone who had once worn the same uniform I did, and outgrew it in a way I hadn't yet. She asked for me by name. "Margot," she said, offering no handshake. "I was head nurse here. Before they removed my records." I didn't ask why. I could see it in the corners of her mouth, how long silence had been her only way of speaking. "I know he's still here," she added. "He doesn't leave." She didn't say Lionel's name, but she didn't need to. She opened her coat, pulled from the inside pocket something that made my hands instinctively clench. A notebook, identical to the one I'd hidden beneath a stack of files in my drawer. Same leather, same smell, even the frayed corner. "This was mine," she said. "He gave it to me on the third week. Said I needed a place to put the things I didn't want to forget." I couldn't speak. She opened to the center. I saw poetry, fragments of lyrics, and a small pressed flower, faded now like something once offered too easily. "You think it's love," she said gently, "but he's just very good at listening. And leaving." Her voice didn't accuse. It warned. Before she left, she turned back once. "You're not the first. That doesn't make you less. Just not what you thought." After she disappeared into the fog, I went straight to my drawer. The notebook was still there. I opened it with both dread and a desperate kind of hope. Inside was a single new page. His handwriting. Slanted left. "Come. I don't lie. I just let people see what they want to believe." I couldn't breathe for a second. Then I laughed. Not out of humor. More like the laugh that escapes when the air's been too tight for too long. That night I asked him, directly, was I just another? He didn't look away. He didn't soften it. "You stayed," he said. "You chose to." There was no comfort in that. But no deceit either. I sat by the window after he left. The same place I once found warmth from his shadow. But now the shadow didn't fall there anymore. I poured ginger tea. It was perfect this time. Exactly the right shade, scent, taste. And I hated it. Because now I knew what I'd been trying to recreate wasn't the tea. It was the moment it first tasted like more than a drink. I picked up the photo frame on my desk. Empty. I'd always meant to put a picture there, one of us maybe. I tried to recall if anyone ever took one. They hadn't. No evidence. No proof. Just warmth and breath and silence. All of it real, but only in memory. Maybe that's all it ever was. Maybe memory was the only thing he ever left behind. Maybe I let him. Or maybe he knew, from the first moment, that I was already halfway toward him, and just waited until I crossed. I looked for a picture of us. There wasn't one. No photo. No record. No proof. Just the scent of ginger, and the imprint where I'd once thought his hand had rested. It was still dark when I arrived. The kind of dark that doesn't feel temporary. No one else was there. My last shift. The last hour before I became someone who used to work here. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. The silence didn't need help. I walked the hallway slower than usual. Not for nostalgia. Just to feel the weight of the steps. Each one saying, "You were here." Each one asking, "Was it worth it?" Inside the exam room, everything looked as it always had. Except the air. The air carried something. Not quite scent, not quite memory. Something in between. Then I saw it. A cup. White porcelain. Steam rising like a hush. Ginger. No name. No note. Just the cup. On the desk. Warm. I didn't touch it. Not because I was angry. Not even because I was afraid. But because I knew now. When something is offered too gently, too perfectly, it's not for drinking. It's for remembering. I sat on the edge of the cot, hands in my lap, eyes on the window. There was a crack in the corner pane, fine as a hairline. I hadn't noticed it before. The light was different today. Not warm. Not cold. Just honest. I opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. The journal was still there. The one with the faded leather cover. Pages half filled with questions I never intended to answer. I placed a letter beside it, folded once. No name, no explanation. But the handwriting was mine, a little tired, a little steadier than I expected. Even if I was never the only one, I still choose to remember. That, too, is a kind of refusal. I didn't take anything. Not the cup. Not the journal. Not the cardigan slung over the chair. Not even the breath I'd been holding. I just left. On the way out, I passed the bench where he always sat, same cushion, still faintly dipped where his weight used to be. I didn't smooth it out. I didn't sit there. I didn't even slow down. At the doorway I paused. The sun had finally broken through. And where it landed, right on the wall by the cracked glass, it looked like a line. Not just of light but of choice. Some people need confrontation. Some need closure. I only needed the quiet to mean something. I didn't expose him. Didn't write a report. Didn't shout. But I didn't play the game anymore either. That was the choice. To walk away before the story bent me into someone I no longer recognized. Not to punish. Not to forgive. Just to not repeat. Because some patterns only end when someone chooses not to echo. The wind outside had shifted. A spring wind. Kind but not soft. I didn't cry. Not because I was strong but because the tears had already happened just on the inside in small invisible places. I didn't pack much. Just a coat, my shoes, and the name I came with. Still mine. As I stepped past the gate, the road curved. The clinic faded behind me like a place you half dream, half escape. And I whispered, not to anyone, not for effect, just to the part of myself I was taking back. I didn't come here to be healed. I came to learn how to stay whole. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. I didn't fall into it. I wasn't fooled. I walked in with my eyes open, and that's the part that stings the most. 'Cause I wanted it. Not the man. Not the praise. I wanted to believe someone saw me without me having to ask. But I've stopped needing proof. I don't need the journal. I don't need a photo. I don't need to hear my name in anyone's mouth but my own. I wasn't chosen. I chose. And that choice, quiet as it was, changed everything. There was a time I apologized just for wanting to be seen. Wanting to stay. Wanting something soft to hold in a world that asks us to be useful or be gone. I used to whisper my needs into pillows, thinking they'd sound less needy that way. But here's the truth. Desire doesn't make you weak. It makes you honest. And honesty is heavier than shame, but it builds stronger walls. If you've ever been like me, waiting for someone to hand you permission, stop. No one gives it. You claim it. With steady hands. With nothing but your name and the knowledge that wanting more is not a crime. If any part of this story held your breath for just a moment, if a word or a silence made you feel like someone finally spoke what you hadn't, then maybe, just maybe, leave a mark. A like. A quiet nod. Not for me. For you. So others might see it and know someone else felt it too. And if this finds someone on the edge of silence, unsure if they're allowed to say what they've kept buried, maybe now they will. Because I didn't stay to be saved. I stayed long enough to know I don't need saving. And I left before I forgot that. I never told anyone about that last morning. But the tea was warm. And the window had been left open, just wide enough for a breeze. Or a choice.